I want to welcome you all out today to our third lecture in this series on the early church for the first few hundred years. For those that are just joining this week and are new to the series, you can still access the previous two lectures online. They will be up for the duration of the course. What we'll be doing today is we're going to be continuing our discussion of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Last week we spoke about Nero and the fire in Rome, and this week we're going to continue talking about our next piece of evidence that comes from around the year 112, 113 from the province of Bithynia Pontus, and it has to do with the governor Pliny writing to the emperor Trajan about Christians in his province. And he's made a tour of his province, and he's writing to the Emperor Trajan regarding Christians and what he should do with them as he's been making a tour of this province. And he knows there's already a precedent for persecuting Christians. And again, this is really important evidence because it includes the emperor and direct correspondence with the emperor. And so what happens is Pliny then writes the emperor and asks him basically if the procedure that he's been following with Christians is the correct one. And so he begins to outline in a letter what he's been doing and basically wants to get approval from the emperor for his actions. And it's really with a certain group where he's really unsure of the correct procedure and how we should proceed. So as we mentioned last week, he talks about how when Christians were accused before him, they were brought before him. And this is the beginning of the letter where he says, "They were brought before me, and if they were not Roman citizens, and they, after warning them, right, of the impending punishment, right, it's a capital crime, they did not recant, he would then have them executed." And that's if they're non-Roman citizens, right? Because in the Roman Empire, for non-Roman citizen, the governor has the imperium or the power, right, in terms of capital punishment. He then says those who would not recant, right, they were Christians, he then said he would, and who were Roman citizens, he had sent to Rome, and there they're going to be tried. So he's assuming this is the correct procedure here. And again, he's already been doing this, so clearly there's some precedent already there. He then says, that there was another group, and with this other group, he says there were some that said that, that they were accused of being Christian, but they outright denied it. And he says what he made them do is go and make a libation or an offering to the gods, that they would then curse Christ. Pliny then says, I understand that a true Christian can't do this. He says, those people who were falsely accused and went and performed these actions, he said, well, I let them go. But it's now this third group, and here's where we ended off last week, where Pliny has some questions. He's trying to get some direction from the emperor. He says there were some who were accused of being Christians, and at first, look what it says here, they admitted it, but then they denied, saying they'd ceased being Christians, in some cases 2 years previously, or some said they had stopped already being Christians some 20 years earlier. And so here, Pliny's not exactly sure what to do with this group, right? Because he's not sure saying, what is the basis of the charge against the Christians, right? In Latin, you have this phrase, is it the nomen ipsum, or the name itself? Or is Pliny saying, is there something they do that is the reason or the basis for why they are then being punished? And he says, listen, these people denied it, right? They went and they cursed Christ, right? They made a libation. And he says, I went and I interrogated them and said, what were you doing as Christians? And you see here in the middle portion of this slide, he says, well, what they confessed to doing when they were Christians is they would meet before dawn on a fixed day, again, presumably Sunday. They would chant verses alternatively, right, to Christ as to a God, right? So sing hymns, right, to or about Christ. They would then bind themselves by a number of oaths or covenants, right? They wouldn't, engage in criminal activity. They wouldn't steal. They wouldn't commit adultery, things like this. And afterward, they would then get together and partake of food of, look what he says here, an ordinary harmless kind. I'm going to explain that passage, why he says an ordinary harmless kind a little later on. So when Pliny then asks these people what they were doing, he's a little bit shocked that there's really nothing untoward going on. So not really believing them, he then says, look, Emperor, I even went and I took 2 slaves who were called deaconesses, and I tortured them to make sure, right, they were telling the truth. And I really want to get to the bottom of this. One of the thinking here with Pliny and in the Roman Empire is People won't tell you the truth in many cases unless you first subject them to torture. In fact, you find a similar episode in the book of Acts, when Paul is taken by Claudius Lysis in Acts at the Temple Mount, right? There's this insurrection, right? Kind of a tumult going on at the temple. Claudius Lysis says, right, go and have him scourged and we'll find out what's going on here. And Paul says, you can't scourge me, I'm a Roman citizen, right? He has this right. And so here, right, these are slaves, so he goes and does this. And even after torturing 2 women who are called deaconesses, there's really nothing untoward going on. Although Pliny says, look, this is basically nothing but a degenerate cult, right, carried to extravagant lengths. Now, just let me pause here for a moment. I think the title deaconesses is worth explaining a little bit, right? This word deaconess comes from the Greek word, right, diakonos, from where we get our word deacon, and the word literally means servant, okay? And in fact, this is not the first reference to female deaconesses or deacons in the church. In fact, if you go back to Romans chapter 16, and in the first few verses of Romans 16, there a woman by the name of Phoebe is mentioned. And there it says she was a, quote, servant of the church at Cenchrea, unquote. In fact, in Romans, this is the letter carrier who's going to carry the epistle of Romans that was written presumably while Paul was in Corinth on his 3rd mission out to Rome. And there it calls her a servant, but it's the same Greek word. And so much like the word apostle, it can have a few different meanings. It can mean one of the 12, or it can mean actually literally a missionary or one who sent forth. You have in the early church, right, deaconess or deacon can mean, right, perhaps a calling of some sort, an ordained calling, or it can just mean a servant. And what we find with deacons often involved in the early church with kind of temporal needs of members. We'll talk more about deacons here a little bit later in one of the texts we're reading. But this is really interesting, right? So even after torturing 2 women, right, who were slaves and who are Christians, there's really nothing going on that Pliny finds untoward. So he's kind of scratching his head saying, okay, well, that's really the basis of why we're persecuting these people. But in this case, it's like, well, what do I do with these people who are formerly Christians and are no longer Christians? And look how Pliny then ends his letter. And this is really interesting. He says, look, since I've begun now, right, to really go after Christians in this province, right, some have been executed, some have been sent to Rome, some now, this 3rd group, I'm not sure what to do with. I'm basically holding them incarcerated until I get word from you, Emperor, what I should do. Look what he says here. He first of all says he's finding that Christians occupy all classes. He says you find young, you find old, both men and women, right, in the towns and in the cities. But then he says, you know, now that I'm starting to do this and really go after this group, I'm noticing now that the traditional temples in this area are once again being visited. And the traditional cults that had previously lapsed, people are going to and are making offerings. So it's interesting. I sometimes wonder if perhaps Pliny, this is brought to Pliny's attention by basically an economic motive, that some non-Christians bring these Christians to Pliny's attention because perhaps they're hurting the business at the local temples. In fact, as I think about this, just think back to a moment for Acts chapter 19, right? Paul is in Ephesus in Acts chapter 19. He's going to be in Ephesus for upwards of 3 years. And what ultimately drives him out of Ephesus is there's going to be a riot in the town, but we're told there it started by a man called Demetrius, who was a silversmith. And he was making little, right, statuettes of the goddess, right, Diana, which is Artemis, because in Ephesus that was the patron goddess. And so clearly there, what we're told in Acts 19 is that Demetrius goes and gets the fellow silversmiths and says, look, this Paul is preaching against idolatry. And in fact, he's going to put our craft out of business if he's successful. Clearly Paul's had some success. There's actually an economic reason why they then cause this uproar in the city and Paul ultimately gets run out of town. And I wonder if there's a similar kind of scenario going on here in light of what Pliny's saying. And Pliny then concludes the letter by saying, look, Emperor, if you allow these people some space for repentance, a lot of good can come about here. And so what Pliny's basically saying is those who have recanted or apostatized from being Christians, there's really no need to punish them because it's clear they haven't actually committed an actual crime. And so this is then what he writes to the emperor. Now, the response that's given by Trajan you have here, and it's very, very short. And it's really quite interesting. Trajan says, look, Pliny, all in all, you followed the right course. Right? Those who won't recant, right, if they're non-Roman citizens, you can execute them, Roman citizens, send them to Rome. But those who deny ever being Christians, or those who recant, who maybe formerly were at one point but now recant, he says, you now can, right, basically exculpate them of any wrongdoing, as long as they then, right, curse Christ and make a libation to the gods. And what we're told, right, Pliny talked about how when he began looking into this matter of Christians, how an anonymous pamphlet had circulated, and so all kinds of people were accused now of being Christians. Trajan then says, I think rather ironically, says, well, this pamphlet is totally against the spirit of our times. If somebody wants to accuse somebody of being a Christian, they have to come and do it in person. They can't just submit an anonymous pamphlet. And so what Trajan, in effect, said is he says, yes, Christians can be persecuted, they can be tried solely for being Christians. Now what's ironic here is it's a totally novel legal category in the Roman Empire, right? What's the basis of the crime? The name. And Pliny's wondering, what have they done? Well, they've done nothing wrong. It's just the name itself. And so as we're going to see as we get into apologetic literature, a lot of Christians are going to say, what's wrong with being called a Christian? We're not committing thievery, we're not stealing, we're not killing, we're not doing all these things. So what's the crime in a name? But it's a really ironic legal category that Christians find themselves in the 2nd century. And this will continue more or less for some time. We'll see this reconfirmed by the next emperor, Hadrian. Now, what I want to do is I want to step away for a moment, Christianity in the Roman Empire, and let's just return to the Apostolic Fathers, right? We talked about this collection of writings, which are earliest extant Christian writings. We've looked at some of them like the Didache, we talked about 1 Clement, we talked about the epistles of Ignatius of Antioch. What I want to do here is I want to talk just really briefly about Polycarp, specifically the martyrdom of Polycarp. We have a very early martyrdom account in Christianity. In fact, our very earliest one relates to an early bishop in Smyrna. So we talked about Ignatius, who was an early bishop in Antioch, and he wrote 7 letters. And interestingly enough, if you had a chance to look at those letters, one of those letters was addressed to Polycarp, who was the bishop in Smyrna. And we have an account written by later disciples of how Polycarp ultimately died, and it's our very first martyrdom account in Christianity outside of the New Testament, right? You, of course, maybe you could say the martyrdom of Stephen, right, in Acts 7, the martyrdom of James, right, in Acts 12, right? You have, of course, Jesus, right, his passion, or you could say as a martyrdom of sorts in the Gospels. And we're told, right, of Christian martyrs, but now we actually have an account of this. And so I want to talk just a little bit about this because it's the very first one. And martyrdom accounts will become very popular in Christianity. And what you'll often find with later martyrdom accounts, and certainly those that are written much later that purport to tell of an earlier martyrdom, they get grander and grander, and often I would say more sensationalized. But what you find in some of these early accounts, I think, are depictions of Christians, right, as they kind of meet their end, mostly devoid of a lot of sensational elements that you might find in much, much later accounts from like the Byzantine period or the early medieval period. And this is the first one, so it does deserve a little bit of attention. I'm not going to go into it in any kind of detail, but just kind of give you an overview of what happens in this account. And so in this martyrdom of Polycarp, it's the first that we have. And the way this martyrdom account survives, it survives in the form of a letter that is written from the church of Smyrna to the church of Philomelium that relates to how Polycarp, their beloved bishop, met his end. And one of the things we're told in this martyrdom account is that Polycarp was 86 years old when he was put to death in the arena in Smyrna. Now, how this martyrdom account begins is the author of this account. We're not sure who this author is. I might imagine it was perhaps some disciples or members of the congregation at Smyrna who knew Polycarp, who revered him as their bishop. But again, we're not exactly sure who they are. But it is sent from Smyrna right to Philomelium. And there they talk about how, there was a persecution there in Smyrna. It talked about how there were various martyrs who met their end. And it tells us about them very, very quickly without going into details. One of the things it tells us about some of these martyrs, and you're going to find this in martyr literature in early Christianity, is they want to stress that martyrs, that the true martyrs, those who were really faithful and were really right, the Spirit of God was upon them as they were being put to death, that they basically felt no pain. And the Greek word that's used here is the word apatheia. It's where we get our modern word apathy from. So trying to say they were apathetic in the face of pain. Now, the word apathy doesn't quite get, right? When we think of the word apathy today, it has really a negative connotation where you don't really care. But in the ancient world, when you think of, for philosophically minded people, one of the dominant philosophies was Stoicism. And one of the goals of Stoicism, and this was kind of revered, in general, even by those who necessarily wouldn't practice, Stoicism, but even by Christians, was you want to become apathetic. Apathetic meaning that you're not controlled by your passions. And in this case, right, where Christians are being, put to death in some very gruesome ways as this martyrdom begins, saying it was as though they didn't even feel pain. And so they were able to basically grin and bear some very, severe circumstances that led to their death. So it starts like this, and it says there were 12 martyrs in total, and then it says, then there was Polycarp. And so it talks then about how the bishop met his martyrdom. And one of the things to say about Polycarp in this martyrdom, it says, look, he died and had a martyrdom in accordance with, quote, the gospel. So really what it's doing in this early martyrdom is saying, this is how a martyr really ought to go and die. And one of the things that becomes clear here with Polycarp, and one of the things we find in this text, is right before it talks about Polycarp, it talks about a man called Quintus, who, when he learned that Christians were being, put to death and martyred, that he voluntarily went forth. And when he voluntarily went forth to do this, right before the governor, he then became terrified and then recanted and didn't do this. And so one of the points that's made with Polycarp is Polycarp doesn't voluntarily go forth. They have to go and find him. He goes into hiding, but they find him. But once he's captured then, he will willingly, be led as kind of, a sheep to the slaughter. And one of the things that's interesting when you read this martyrdom account is you'll find a lot of echoes where when you read the passion account, of Jesus and his, last day or two, how he's betrayed and, how he is led to his execution, there's a lot of similarities to how Polycarp is depicted. It's like the authors who wrote this martyrdom in some way want to accentuate as many parallels between Polycarp and Jesus as they possibly could. And one of the things we have then with Polycarp is going to be brought in before the governor, and then threatened on various occasions, saying, if you don't recant, you'll be put to death. Polycarp will make the point saying, look, I've lived as a Christian, nearly 86 years, an old man by this age, and saying, I'm not changing my mind now, and none of your threats will change my mind. And so ultimately then he's going to be hauled into the arena. And in the arena, first of all, they'll threaten to put wild animals upon him. They'll then bind him, They'll begin to burn him, and ultimately he'll be killed, by the thrusting of a sword in his side, and he'll then die in the arena. And one of the things it then says as this martyrdom account ends, it says that what happened was they would not allow Christians to go and to take the body. And lest, it says here, they feared that in fact they would stop worshiping Jesus and start worshiping Polycarp. And so it makes a note here that in fact they took his body and disposed of it, so Christians couldn't actually take the body. One of the things that happens in Christianity in later centuries, and probably already maybe in the 3rd or the 2nd centuries, is that Christians would, erect what are called as a martyrium, or plural martyria, and later these martyria might become chapels, but it's often they would build a chapel, at least in the 4th century, on the spot of alleged martyrdom, thinking that in fact there was greater power there because a saint had died there. And so presume the body is actually, buried there. In fact, think of St. Peter's Cathedral today at the Vatican. It's believed, that Peter is actually buried there, by the Catholic Church. And so it kind of starts off as a martyrium. So this is what you have in this martyrdom. It's quite interesting, and it's our very first one. And again, you kind of see then up close how this takes place. And there's various other martyrdoms that you have in the 2nd, and then in the 3rd, and then in the 4th century. Now, having just mentioned the martyrdom of Polycarp, I want to now talk about Christian apology in the 2nd century and the rise of apologetic literature. Because what you're going to have now, it's pretty clear by the start of the 2nd century, as we saw from the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, as well as the letter, of Pliny to Trajan, is that it's pretty tough being a Christian. And in fact, not only can you be persecuted, officially by the government, but even, mobs, and there's a lot of rumors swirling about Christians. They're really a targeted group. And so what you then find is that Christians begin to write apologetic literature as defenses for what they're doing and for their faith. And so I want to talk about this literature. We're actually going to read the earliest extant apology from the middle of the 2nd century, which is really quite fascinating. We'll spend some time looking at that here momentarily. Now, when we think about this word apology or apologetic, it comes from the Greek word apologia, where we think of it's an apology, but this word in Greek originally meant a defense or a speech in defense. And one of the places you find this word appears about 7 or 8 times in the New Testament. But the one that really, I think, encapsulate what we think of apologetic literature is the usage that you find in 1 Peter 3:15. And remember what I said about 1 Peter 3:15, 1 Peter in general last week, was I think the best way to read this letter is in the wake of the Neronian persecution in Rome, where Christians have been accused, right, of starting this fire, and this horrible persecution is initiated against them. And it's pretty clear there's some really hard things going on when this letter is written. And one of the things it says here, and I'll just read this here, 3:15, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear." And the way this letter begins is it talks, they're enjoined by Peter to have, quote, "a living hope," unquote, in Jesus Christ and his resurrection. And so what Peter's saying is here is saying, look, when, right, people ask you, why do you believe in this Jesus guy? Make sure you're ready to give an answer of that hope that's in you, but do it in meekness and in fear. Well, the answer here is be prepared to give a defense or a reason for that. And so this is what this literature is. It's giving a reason for why are they Christians? What's most important to them? Why they should not be persecuted? They should not be singled out. And it's really a unique body of literature that now begins to emerge in Christianity. So from the 2nd century, as you see here in this slide, we have various treatises. Not all of them survived. So for example, the very first apology or defense of Christianity was written by a man called Quadratus. We know very little about him. Allegedly, he was from Athens. He delivers this to the Emperor Hadrian, and we're told by a much later Christian source about it very briefly, but it's no longer extant. We also have an apology by an early Christian called Aristides, which for a long time was lost. It was written in Greek, but at the end of the 19th century, a Syriac copy was found of this. You could kind of see what he was putting in that apology. As you get into Justin, Tatian, Melito, Athenagoras, Theophilus, Tertullian, and others, we now have, right, these texts in their entirety in the original language in which they were written. And they're really quite remarkable treatises, each in their own right. And what we're going to be looking at here momentarily is the Apologies of Justin Martyr. Gets the epithet martyr because he is actually martyred in Rome in the about 160. But he does write our first extant, right, defense of Christianity. And so we'll look at that. But let's just try to frame why Christians now begin writing this literature in defense of their faith and their practices, and essentially for why they are Christians. And so let's try to give some context to this before we jump into this literature, and especially Justin's first apology. Well, what's going on here? It's pretty clear that Christians are being singled out, right? There's hostility directed against them, and it's very clear that it is okay to persecute them. And that's very clear, right, from the correspondence of Trajan. That if somebody wants to bring you forward and you're not going to recant, right, there is a good chance you could potentially lose your life. And so this apologetic literature is kind of making the case, in some extent, saying this is a really ironic legal category we're in. We've actually done nothing wrong, and yet you're putting us to death. And so it's kind of being generated, becoming some of the biases and hostility directed against Christians. That's part of it. And so there's kind of this, with some of these writings, like Justin will get into this. Also, Tertullian will get into this in his apology that he writes. Kind of some of this really strange, legal category that Christians find themselves in, and pointing out, saying this is really ironic. There's nothing else like this in Roman law, where you can actually say I'm no longer something and now you're no longer punished. But if you admit to being that, you're now potentially could have your life taken from you. Something else you're going to find in this kind of literature, and this is really interesting, I think this will resonate with Latter-day Saints, is there's all kind of slanders that are being made against Christians in the 2nd century, presumably somewhat earlier, but we really get our evidence now in the 2nd century. And they're accused of doing all kinds of things. In fact, in Latin, the term that comes up is flagitia, is that Christians are accused of perpetrating various abominations. And they're really wild stories, right? The Christians are accused. Now, when we went back, and I'll just go back to this slide here for a moment. If you look at this slide here, look what what Pliny says. He says, look, I asked these Christians what they were doing. They would get together, and then they would have food. And look what you have here. If you follow the cursor, they'd reassemble to take food of an ordinary, harmless kind. Now, you wonder, well, what's going on? Well, one of the rumors that we know is circulating in the 2nd century against Christians, and one of the things that apologists will make a big deal about is saying, look, we are not cannibals. One of the accusations we know, at least at a popular level that's made against them, is that in their secret ceremonies, which only Christians were allowed to, partake in, is they would actually eat people. And so among the masses, this kind of became, right, kind of a popular rumor that would be circulated against the Christians. And Pliny apparently was somewhat persuaded by this and said, look, when I interrogated them, they didn't actually, this was just ordinary food. If you remember last week we looked about the letter to Diognetus, he also made the point saying, look, we just get together, we have ordinary food. And probably what's driving some of this is that non-Christians hear about the sacrament, where members are partaking of the flesh and blood of Jesus, right? Think back maybe to John chapter 6 here, and thinking, well, they're maybe, doing something untoward, and they're accusing him of cannibalism. Now, I cannot think of an actual report where Christians are ever convicted of cannibalism, but there's various charges that are floating around out there, and so Christians will address this and saying, look, we don't commit cannibalism. Other abominations they're accused of committing, saying, look, when they get together, no one's allowed there, is because they're committing all sorts of immorality. And so one of the points that's going to be made here in this apologetic literature is say, no, Christians actually live a very chaste life. We are not immoral people or sexually immoral. And so you'll find things like this that kind of address popular rumors that are circulating in the Roman Empire. There's various other rumors that are circulating also, which, acts they are performing. And generally people are saying, look, Christians are crazy, they're irrational. How else could they worship this Christ figure, a man who was crucified under Pontius Pilate? And so this literature will then say, well, here's why we worship this man. This is what Jesus actually did. And what's interesting here is we think of some of these, wild rumors that are circulating against Christians in the 2nd century. For me, when I read some of this stuff, it's not unlike maybe some wild rumors you might find perhaps in 19th century anti-Mormon literature of things that Mormons are allegedly doing in Utah or in a temple or something like that, which is meant to, provoke animosity towards members of the church. Now, what's interesting here is let me just give you a couple examples of this that comes from apologetic literature. So one of the things, right, Justin, we won't get into this treatise. He has a dialogue we'll talk about. But one of the things he says, and I ask you this, have you also believed concerning us that we eat men, and that after the feast, having extinguished the lights, we engage in promiscuous concubinage? Meaning, saying there's rumors out there we're eating people and we're immoral. He says, do you really believe this? This is nonsense. We don't do anything of the sort. We're told in another apologetic piece, written probably towards the beginning of the 3rd century. And this here is a really interesting piece because here it's framed as a dialogue between a Christian and a non-Christian who's quite hostile to Christianity. And the non-Christian then says, this is what you people do when you actually get together in your meetings. He says, quote, I am told that under some idiotic impulse, they consecrate and worship the head of an ass, the meanest of all beasts. They also take an infant cased in dough to deceive the unsuspecting and place it beside the person to be initiated. The novice is thereupon induced to inflict what seems harmless blows upon the dough, and unintentionally the infant is killed by his unsuspecting blows. So one of the things that is alleged against Christians is that they're actually killing children in their meetings, and that when they initiate somebody into becoming a Christian, they basically encase a baby in dough, and the initiate then starts punching. It's a really wild story. But these are the things that are circulating that Christians are now addressing. One of the ones that's interesting is they're accused of worshiping, right, the head of an ass or a donkey. And what's interesting here with this accusation, if you look at the pictures here at the bottom of this slide, here is an early graffito from the Palatine in Rome, probably from the 3rd century. And just like, when you think of, graffiti today, sometimes untoward, right? Has, various, innuendos, or it's mocking. Think of somebody go into a restroom and somebody scribbled something in a stall or on a wall. We have this from the Roman Empire. And here's a graffito from the Palatine. And if you look at what you have here, look at that. It has a man, and then he looks up. You have a man who has a head of an ass, and he's actually being crucified. And there you have a Greek inscription, which reads, Alexamenos sebete theon, which reads, Alexamenos worships God. And so clearly what it's doing here is it's mocking somebody named Alexamenos, who's a Christian. And what does their God have Christ? Well, Christ's head is that of an ass or a donkey. And so it's meant to mock Christians. And so you're finding rumors like this circulating. And what's interesting about this is, just if we go back to Josephus for a moment, we talked about him a couple weeks ago. He wrote a work called Against Appian. He wrote this at the end of the 1st century. And Appian was an Egyptian who wrote an anti-Jewish tractate that circulated in Alexandria and was quite popular, apparently, in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, where he went and he basically castigated Jews and said they do all kinds of crazy things. And he says in their temple they do especially crazy things. What do they do in their temple? They eat people and they worship the head of an ass, which is their god. And so this rumor then seems to be kind of transferred from Jews over to Christians. Again, think today about rumors that circulate about LDS and all kinds of allegedly untoward things they do in their temple. When I read accusations like this from the 1st century against Jews, or in the 2nd century against Christians, or against in the 19th centuries against Mormons, my response is from Ecclesiastes, there's really nothing new under the sun. And so you find these things, and so they will then address and say, look, we don't do this. Here's what we actually do. So the literature is really useful then to figure out what are Christians actually doing in their services. And when you think of this apologetic literature, what I like to think about this, and I think it's quite interesting, if you think going back again to some ties with 19th century Mormonism, when you had kind of a period where this was really intense, and there were all kind of rumors being put out there in the media of the time of what Mormons allegedly did and the practices they participated in, you have this great quote by John Taylor. He says this, "To avoid misrepresentation, we adopt self-representation." And so this is where the church made an effort saying, look, here's what we actually do. Here are our beliefs. And what you're finding here in this apologetic literature is Christians now in the 2nd century doing just this. There's all kind of rumors circulating about what they allegedly do and what they allegedly believe, and it's saying, look, here's what we actually do. And in fact, so we have no part in such, wild rumors. We don't do anything of the sort. And so I think there's an interesting parallel to be found there. Now, going back to this slide here, right? Why else are Christians writing apologetic literature? Well, one of the reasons they're writing this is because they're accused of upsetting the ways of the ancestors. One of the things you need to be aware of in Roman and even Greek religion is it was very traditional and conservative. And people would have practices, and if you ask them, well, why do you do this practice? They would say, well, because my father did it, my grandfather did it, my great-grandfather did this, so on and so forth. So anything new was viewed with extreme suspicion. Well, Christianity was relatively new. When you think about Greek and Roman religion, right? That Christ, right, came in the time of Pontius Pilate, right? In the first half of the 1st century. Christians are aware of that, and so they're going to make some really interesting arguments. Talk about, in fact, saying, look, we're not upsetting the ways of the ancestors. In fact, one of the things they're going to say is, in fact, Christianity is even older than Greek and Roman religion. So we look at Justin, for example, he's going to make the point that saying, look, Plato was actually using the law of Moses. And the law of Moses pointed toward Christ. It was already there. And so some really interesting ways they're going to argue about this and saying, look, we're not upsetting this. In fact, we're doing something that actually is very ancient and has a very ancient pedigree. One final thing you find, and again, I'm just kind of summarizing this generally in this apologetic literature, is you will have the allegation that Christians are upsetting in their worship what's known as the Pax Deorum. And Christians will then respond to this. Now, what does this Latin phrase Pax Deorum means? Well, it literally means the peace of the gods. And in Greek and Roman religion, right, just like in the law of Moses, right, there are sacrifices going on, there are temples, and there's things they would believe that people should do to their gods and goddesses. And of course, in Greek and Roman religion, you have gods and goddesses over various facets of life, like Demeter, for example, over agriculture and things like that. And so what you would do then is you make the appropriate sacrifices to the appropriate god or goddess. ideally what the thinking was is that in return then you might have a good harvest that year, or you might be healthy, or something like this. And when things went wrong in the Roman Empire or the Greek world, people often thought, okay, somebody's offended the gods in some ways, and if we make this right, then whatever hardship we're facing, whether it might be a famine or a plague or something else, we'll get this right. And one of the things we're finding then is that when things do go wrong in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, in some cases Christians then get blamed, saying, look, they've offended the gods. Therefore, we have to go after them and to punish them so that the gods will then entreat us and do what we deserve. And so you have this really interesting passage then in Tertullian, his Apology, where he gives this really interesting quote that really relates to this. And he makes the point saying, look, we're not actually upsetting this quote-unquote peace of the gods. But he says this, but he kind of encapsulates why Christians are persecuted sometimes during this period. Look what he says here. The pagans suppose the Christians are the cause of every public disaster. If the Tiber overflows or the Nile doesn't, if there is a drought or an earthquake, a famine or a pestilence, at once the cry goes up, the Christians to the lions. And so they're going to then address this in various ways by saying, look, we're not upsetting this. And one of the things that's really quite interesting we're going to see in some of these early apologies, and you're going to find this hard to believe, certainly from our modern perspective, is that Christians are accused of being, quote, atheists, unquote, in the ancient world. Now you might think, how on earth could they be accused of being atheists? And as atheists then, they're accused of upsetting this Pax Deorum. But what the accusation is they don't worship our gods. In fact, they don't even recognize our gods. And that's why they're called atheists. And so as we're going to see in some of these apologies, Christians say, look, we're not atheists. We actually worship the one true and living God who is over all. And so they're going to make this point. But this should give you a little bit better of a context than to understand why Christians then begin to produce all this apologetic literature. So what I want to do here for the remainder of our session today is I want to talk about this first apology of Justin Martyr, who is a Christian who lives in Rome. In fact, originally he's from Samaria, and we know a little bit about his life from various references in some of his extant works. He's from the region of Samaria, will ultimately go to Rome to study philosophy. He's not actually a Christian in his early life. And he talks about how he encountered a man one day when he was walking along the shore who was a Christian who began to expound Christians' doctrines to him, and he became very impressed. And in fact, one of the things that he said, which is really quite interesting in his writings, he says, what most impressed me about Christians is that other people would cling to life and do anything to save their lives. Christians, however, would willingly die for their beliefs. And when Justin saw this, and they're talking to this anonymous Christian that he claims to have talked to at some point, he becomes converted. And it's really interesting, right, that for Justin, their actions spoke far, far louder than their words. And in fact, when you look there, right, if you look, Tertullian writes an apology in the beginning of the 3rd century. One of the things he says there, he has this great statement where he says, look, the blood of Christians is seed. And he makes the point saying, the more you persecute us, the more you kill some of our members, the more in fact we grow because people see who we really are. And so in Justin's case, this actually then first converts him to Christianity. And I would say that for the early church, Justin is one of the intellectuals of the early church, at least based on the writings we have. So he very philosophically minded. And one of the things he's going to do in his apology is he wants to present Christianity as a philosophical school. And it's kind of an ingenious move. So what he wants to do here is he says, look, there are all different kinds of philosophical schools in the Roman Empire, right? You have Stoics, Epicureans, right? Platonists, etc., etc. And he says, look, they all have different beliefs, and yet you don't go after them and punish them. And one of the things that kind of binds these together, right, in some sense, might be the acquisition of virtue. They're trying to aspire to what is virtuous. Remember, when you think about philosophy in the ancient world, today when we study philosophy, you might be very, right, you study at arm's distance. Well, I want to go read Plato. What was Plato saying? But no one really wants to become a Platonist or an Aristotelian, really follow, right, a certain discipline or a Stoic per se. In the ancient world, when you study philosophy, it's because it actually is not just a belief system, but it also actually is what you do in practice. And so Justin's thinking by presenting Christians as philosophers is saying, look, we are yet like another philosophical school. Yes, we have different beliefs, but we also have a founder. Stoics might have a founder like Zeno of Citium. Well, our founder was Jesus Christ, a man who lived, during the reign of Pontius Pilate. And so that's how he tries to present Christians, saying, look, we're another school. And if you don't persecute, different philosophical schools that might have very, different beliefs, why are we being singled out? So let's look here at what he says in this treatise, which is really, really fascinating on a number of fronts. It's quite long, and if you get a chance, I'd really encourage you to read this. Well, this is probably, I would say, kind of post-New Testament. This is one of my favorite texts from the early church because it tells us so much about what's going on. And he addresses a whole variety of issues. And so how this apology begins is he addresses it to the emperor and his sons. Presumably the emperor here, right, is Antoninus Pius, who was emperor from about 138 to about 161 AD. Now let me just make a note here. Even though this apology is addressed to the emperor, I sometimes wonder if the emperor actually ever read this. You might think, yes, we'll think today, right? Maybe you want to go and write a letter to the president of your country. Well, you certainly have the right to do that, but whether or not the president actually ever reads that is completely another matter. And so while Justin addresses to the emperor, maybe intends and has it sent there somehow, I sometimes doubt the emperor would actually read this. But nonetheless, it would certainly go among Christians and among those who are hostile to Christians and probably among lower government officials. And probably by addressing it to the emperor, it gives it kind of an air of authority, saying, wow, I'm addressing the highest authority in the land about why we're Christians and why we shouldn't be persecuted. But this is how they're often addressed. But again, I kind of find it doubtful that in fact the emperor would actually bother reading this. Now, you can look at various sections here in this treatise. We're going to kind of break it down here. So it begins, right, in chapters 2 to 29. He makes a defense, right, against the charge of atheism and various allegations. We're going to look at this. And what really is interesting then in chapters 30 through 60 is he has a whole extended argument on Jesus as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. In fact, this is the most detailed, I would say, analysis of Christ as fulfillment of prophecy that you find in any early Christian text. And he'll use, he'll rely on Matthew as well as on others, saying, look, he's a fulfillment of prophecy. One of the reasons he wants to make this argument is saying, look, we're not irrational. And in fact, we're not just some, right, as Romans are saying, a nova superstitio or a new superstition, right? Superstitio is very pejorative or bad. Religio, where we get our word religion, is very positive. Saying, look, we have an ancient pedigree. In fact, even before Christ came and was incarnate, people were talking about him hundreds and hundreds of years beforehand. And so it's really fascinating as he goes through various prophecies from Isaiah and elsewhere, some used in the New Testament and some used elsewhere, saying these were actually talking about Christ and his coming. When you get into chapters 61 through 67, he then talks about what Christians actually do in their services. So he talks about baptism. In fact, in 67 that we're going to get to in a few minutes, he gives the very earliest description of a sacrament meeting. So we actually see what was going on in Rome in the middle of the 2nd century in church services. And then he concludes, right, with kind of a final plea then to the emperor and to his sons. So let's just kind of work through this text. I want to pick a couple highlights from this apology of things that he's saying. And again, when you read it carefully, especially between the lines, you can glean a lot about what's going on in the early church. So he begins by saying that in fact, why on earth are we being persecuted for the name? And he makes the point saying, look, based on a name, there is nothing good or nothing bad. He says it'd be one thing if you could actually show that Christians were doing anything wrong, but you can't. And he's saying it's based solely on a name that we're being persecuted. He makes the point saying this is a totally illogical legal position. That only on a name you either basically live or die without actually doing any deed. And he says you don't do this with thieves or anybody else. That's always based on an action. But in our case, it's solely based on a name. And look what he says here. I'm just going to read part of this. I'll read from here. For you do not punish the accused among yourselves before they are convicted. But in our case, you take the name as proof against us. And this, although, as far as the name goes, you ought rather to punish the accusers. For we are accused of being Christians. To hate what is favorable is unjust. Again, if one of the accused deny the name, saying that he is not a Christian, you acquit him, as having no proof that he is an evildoer. So he's pointing this out. There's actually a play on the word here, Christian. Let me just talk about this word Christian for a moment. You do get this title for members of the early church. We're told this first appears, it's in Acts chapter 11. So in Acts chapter 11, we're told that in Antioch they were first called Christians. This is with Paul and Barnabas. Then you have one other reference, you have a third reference to Christians that appears in 1 Peter. That's the only references you get in the New Testament. And the word Christian, right, clearly comes from Christos, which means kind of anointing. Christos in Greek is the same as, right, this word Mashiach, or the word Messiah. It means anointed one. But what Justin does here is this word Christos sounds like another Greek word, Christos, not Christos, but Christos, which means good. And he's saying, and here he's making a play on the word, saying, our name even implies that we are good, right? Making Christos sound like Christos. And saying we couldn't do anything bad. And he says, you haven't proven anything bad about us. And he says, well, at least you ought to investigate what we actually do. If it's just a name, he says, you really can't persecute us. Now, one of the things that he says here, and he makes a big point, he says, look, we're accused of being atheists. And he makes the point saying, look, we're not actually atheists. He says, we're only atheists since we don't worship your gods, but we actually worship the one God who is the maker of the universe. And this is really quite interesting. In fact, what Justin's going to go on and argue is he's going to make the point and say basically that these gods and goddesses, which are idolatry, he makes a point saying, look, you've really been misled and have been inspired right by the devil and his demons to worship these, to take away the proper honor from the one true living God. And so here he makes, I might say, a similar kind of argument to what you have that Paul makes, for example, in Acts 17, where he says basically stop worshiping dead gods, start worshiping the one true living God. And he's saying, we do this, therefore we are not atheists, but we do not worship your gods. And one of the points he's going to make, and a point you'll find in a lot of apologetic discourse, he says, look, this one true God doesn't need idols. He doesn't need offerings, right? Because one of the things in Greco-Roman religion, you'll make sacrifice and offering to gods and goddesses. He doesn't need this. He cares far, far more about the offering that we give him in our actions and what we do with our heart. And so this is the line that he takes in saying that this attribute of atheism is not appropriate because they do actually believe in one God who is over all. Now, something we have here in this apology that's quite interesting, and it's here near the beginning here in section 13, is he begins to talk about Jesus. He could talk about Jesus throughout this apology, but I wanted to bring this to you because it's really quite fascinating what he says here. Look what he says here. Our teacher of these things is Jesus Christ, who was also born for this purpose and was crucified under Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, in the time of Tiberius Caesar, right? So some 125 years earlier. And we will show that we worship him rationally, having learned that he is the Son of the true God himself, and holding him in the second place and the prophetic spirit in the third rank. Okay, let's unpack this for a moment, because it's really significant. So he refers back to Jesus. He says that we worship him, but he says we do this in a rational way, right? He's trying to say, like philosophers, there's a reason for this. And he's trying to make this case then in this apology, we are rational. We're not totally crazy people. Very often they'll dismiss Christianity as, well, that's a bunch of crazy people. We need to get rid of them. Think, for example, in Acts 26, right? When Paul talks about the resurrected Christ, what is told him, right, by Festus? Paul, you're crazy. He says, no, I'm not crazy. And so Justin's saying there's actually a reason. And the word rationality comes from this word where we get our word logic or logos. And he's saying, no, there's actually a rationale for why we do this. And it's interesting how he tries to persuade them. In fact, he's going to use logic to persuade them of their argument. The argument of Christianity. Now look what you have here. He says, okay, they worship one true God. And then he says, oh, and we worship Christ. But look what it says here. We hold him in second place and the prophetic spirit in third rank. The point I want to make here is it's very clear that for Justin, Jesus is subordinate to the Father. Okay? This is not Trinitarian thinking by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the word Trinity isn't even used for 300 years to refer to the Godhead. And so it's very clear that he's saying, look, there is God the Father, and then there is God the Son, who is subordinate to the Father. And so I think that's really fascinating when we think of Christology and Trinitarian thinking. Justin is not this at all. It's very clear there's subordination with the Son to the Father. that he talks about the prophetic spirit, right, as kind of a third rank here. But clearly here, right, coming up from the New Testament where you find this, and this is really the general trend of Christian thinkers, really up till Nicaea, is that there's God the Father and the Son is subordinate to the Father. And so I just wanted to make sure you were aware of that little note. You can read through it really quickly without, I think, understanding the significance of this. And here we are in the middle of the 2nd century, and he's talking in these terms about Jesus. Now, what he then does here, and I have to move a little bit quicker, is he begins to address various issues. One of the ones that comes up is, right, saying, well, you've probably heard, right, that we commit all kind of immorality. And he says, that's not true. He says, in fact, as Christians, we aspire to virtue, and we aspire to prudence and to chastity. So he makes a point for 2 chapters saying we don't engage in fornication, and he makes a point about chastity. And he has a really interesting chapter on divorce. I won't have time to get into this, but what he does here is he picks up on Jesus' teaching in divorce in Matthew 5 and makes a point saying, look, we even consider, in accord with Jesus' teaching, even, remarriages in cases could be an example of divorce. But he's making the point saying, look, how could a people that prizes chastity so much possibly engage in immoral actions like the kind you find that are being alleged against us? And some of the things you're going to find here in these chapters, often you can find echoes going right back to the Sermon on the Mount. He talks about, right, forgiveness and mercy. He talks about, in chapter 17, saying, look, we pay taxes. We're not trying to avoid this. In fact, you already find this, right, in Romans and elsewhere. This becomes, Paul admonishes, saying, look, give, right, what the government, right, what they deserve to those who are in authority. In fact, in this case, Justin will actually cite the story in Matthew where you have the denarius, or in the King James, the penny, and Jesus asks, is it lawful basically to pay, the King James says tribute to Caesar, but actually it's taxes to Caesar. And that's where he says, render to God the things of God, and right to Caesar the things of Caesar. And so they're saying there's nothing in our beliefs that prevent us from paying taxes. He then has a really fascinating section on children. And I won't go into this, but he makes the point saying, look, we're virtuous people because unlike society, where there is a practice, where in the ancient world, and it's quite brutal when you think about this, where people would literally just throw out their infants if they didn't want them, he's saying we don't do any such thing. And he says, in fact, we will often go and take up children that are abandoned or thrown out literally at birth, and we will raise them. And part of the reason he then ties this back, he says, look, because a lot of children that get thrown out at birth, they inevitably are scooped up and they're immediately put in at some age into the sex trade. And he's saying, again, because we don't believe in immorality, we will do anything to prevent somebody from falling into this kind of life. So he's making the point here that, in fact, Christians are very virtuous people and addressing these issues that are being thrown against them, right, by the populace at large. He then makes an interesting argument about the resurrection and saying, we as Christians believe in an actual resurrection, that all people will be resurrected. Now, this is interesting because what you get is in the ancient world at this time, the conventional wisdom was among some, philosophical schools. So, for example, for Epicureanism, for example, or Stoicism, is when you're dead, there's nothing else. There were some philosophical schools that said, yes, there is a consciousness after you die. And Justin makes that point, says, when you die, there is a consciousness. But he makes the point that says, well, in fact, there will even be a physical life after this one. And for a lot of ancients, this was very hard to swallow. And it was often mocked, saying, how on earth can there be a resurrection? Because even philosophies that might say there's a actual consciousness after death would say, well, it's not going to be a physical consciousness. It'll be purely spiritual or immaterial. And so Justin then, for 3 chapters, actually talks about saying there will be a literal physical resurrection. People will be raised up. And it was often mocked. In fact, there was another apology written by, I believe, Theophilus, just talking about the issue of the resurrection. So he talks about this for about 3 chapters. What you then get here is after doing this, he then goes, and here I'm going to have to summarize this really quickly, is he talks all about the prophecies of Christ, saying, look, this is not just some new movement that sprung up 100 plus years ago. It's actually was known from of old. Ancient prophets prophesied of this, and he gives all kinds of examples of this. He'll cite Isaiah, he'll cite Micah, he'll cite others. In fact, if you look there in chapter 35, he even cites a work called the Acts of Pilate, an alleged work, right, that relates to what Pilate actually did, which is apparently in circulation at his time as kind of proof that Christ was prophesied of. And if we had time, I'd like to go through this in more details, but it's really quite fascinating. One of the things he does want to make a point of, and I think it's important to think of early Christian doctrine. We look in chapters 43 and 44, he says, look, even though Christ had been prophesied of, this does not get rid of free will. And so he makes it clear, and this is something else you'll find in Christianity, which is universal for the first few centuries before you get, something more along the lines of predestination, non-free will, is what you get here is that you have free will, and as such you can be punished or you can be rewarded. So he's saying even if there's prophecies, it does not mean that this is fated to happen or it somehow removes our free will, and he's adamant on this. And I think that's really interesting. A lot of Christians will also make this point. Something else that comes up here which is interesting, and I think what we'll have to do is probably continue this on into next week as we look through this really interesting apology, is when you look at chapter 31, he talks about what had happened just recently in the Jewish revolt. And I think I ought to just mention this because it's a really interesting reference. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the first Jewish revolt of Rome that took place in AD 66, lasted to AD 70. It took place in Judea, and the result was the temple was totally destroyed. Okay, and it had disastrous results for Judaism. Well, in the year 132, believe it or not, about 70 years later, another revolt took place in Judea. And this was led by a man called Bar Kokhba. Probably his name might have been maybe Kosaba, but Bar Kokhba literally means son of the star. And he said, look, I'm the Messiah, you got to follow me. And the revolt ended in disaster. It was leveled right under the Emperor Hadrian. And in fact, from that time, after that for some time, Jews weren't even allowed in the vicinity of Jerusalem, allegedly under penalty of death. So it was a horrible revolt with disastrous consequences. But the point that Justin makes here is he says, during this revolt, Christians were even hauled in before Jews, and if they would not basically recant and curse Jesus, and basically say Bar Kokhba was the Messiah, they were then punished. He says, yet they didn't do this. And so it's kind of a fascinating little reference there. There are many other things we're going to get to in this apology, but when you read this, you really see a really interesting view of early Christianity. Not only how Justin will be addressing some of these charges against them, but talking about prophecy. And what I really want to focus on at the beginning of next week, before we get into text and scripture, is what Justin tells us in the last third of the treatise, where he talks about, here's what we do as Christians, here's how we worship, here's how we baptized, here's what we do with the sacrament. And it's a really interesting view into the life of Christians, and it's the very earliest one that we have. So I see that our time has just flown by today. I hope you've got something from this lecture in terms of getting a better appreciation for the early church and for what was going on during the 2nd century. Have a fantastic week, and I look forward to seeing you all next week, and we'll resume from this point. Take care.